in which the Scarecrow and Miss Angorian reappear. Hay opened the flower shop the next day. As Howl had pointed out, it could not have been simpler. Every early morning, all they had to do was to open the door with the knob purple down and go out into the swimming green haze to gather flowers. It soon became a routine. Sophie took her stick and her scissors and stumped about, chatting to her stick, using it to test the squashy ground or hook down sprays of high-up choice roses. Michael took an invention of his own, which he was very proud of. It was a large tin tub with water in it, which floated in the air and followed Michael wherever he went among the bushes. The dogman went too. He had a wonderful time rushing about the wet green lanes, chasing butterflies or trying to catch the tiny bright birds that fed on the flowers, while he dashed about. Sophie cut armloads of blue hibiscus, and Michael loaded the bath with orchids, roses, starry white flowers, shiny vermilion ones, or anything that caught his fancy. They all enjoyed this time. Then, before the heat in the bushes grew too intense, they took the day's flowers back to the shop and arranged them in a motley collection of jugs and buckets which Howl had dug out of the yard. 2 of the buckets were actually the 7-league boots. Noting, Sophie thought, as she arranged shocks of gladiolus in them, could show how completely Howl had lost interest in Letty. He did not care now if Sophie used them or not. Howl was nearly always missing while they gathered flowers, and the doorknob was always turned black down. He was usually back for a late breakfast, looking dreamy, still in his black clothes. He would never tell Sophie which suit the black one really was. "I'm in. Morning from Mrs. Penstemon," was all he would say. And if Sophie or Michael asked why Howl was always away at that time, Howl would look injured and say, "If you want to talk to a school teacher, you have to catch her before school starts." Then he would disappear into the bathroom for the next 2 hours. Meanwhile, Sophie and Michael put on their fine clothes and opened the shop. Howl insisted on the fine clothes. He said it would attract custom. Sophie insisted they all wore aprons. And after the first few days, when the people of market shipping simply stared through the window and did not come into the shop became very popular. Word had gone round that Jenkins had flowers like no flowers ever seen before. People Sophie had known all her life came and bought flowers by the bundle. None of them recognized her, and that made her feel very odd. They all thought she was Howl's old mother, but Sophie had had enough of being Howl's old mother. "I'm his aunt," she told Mrs. Cesari. She became Noah's Aunt Jenkins. By the time Howl arrived in the shop in a black apron to match his suit, he usually found it quite busy. He made it busier still. This was when Sophie began to be sure that the black suit was really the charmed gray and scarlet one. Any lady Howl served was sure to go away with at least twice the number of flowers she asked for. Most of the time, Howl charmed them into buying 10 times as much. Before long, Sophie noticed ladies peering in and deciding not to come into the shop when they saw Howl there. She did not blame them. If you just want a rose for a buttonhole, you do not want to be forced to buy 3 dozen orchids. She did not discourage Howl when Howl took to spending long hours in the workshed across the yard. "I'm setting up defenses against the witch before you ask," he said. "By the time I've finished, there will be no way she can get into any part of this place." There was sometimes a problem with leftover flowers. Sophie could not bear to see them wilting overnight. She found she could keep them fairly fresh if she talked to them. After that, she talked to flowers a lot. She got Michael to make her a plant nutrition spell, and she experimented in buckets in the sink and in tubs in the alcove where she used to trim hats. She found she could keep some plants fresh for days, so of course she experimented some more. She got the soot out of the yard and planted things in it, muttering busily. She grew a navy blue rose like that, which pleased her greatly. Its buds were coal black, and its flowers opened bluer and bluer until they became almost the same blue as calcifer. Sophie was so delighted with it that she took roots from all the bags hanging on the beams and experimented with those. She told herself she had never been happier in her life. This was not true. Something was wrong, and Sophie could not understand what. Sometimes she thought it was the way no one in Market Chipping recognized her. She did not dare go and see Martha, for fear Martha would not know her either. She did not dare tip the flowers out of the 7-league boots and go and see Letty for the same reason. She just could not bear either of her sisters to see her as an old woman. Michael went off with bunches of spare flowers to see Martha all the time. Sometimes Sophie thought that was what was the matter with her. Michael was so cheerful, and she was left on her own in the shop more and more often. But that did not seem to be quite it. Sophie enjoyed selling flowers on her own. Sometimes the trouble seemed to be Calcifer. Calcifer was bored. He had nothing to do except to keep the castle gently drifting along the lanes of grass and round the various pools and lakes, and to make sure that they arrived in a new spot with new flowers every morning. His blue face was always leaning eagerly out of the grate when Sophie and Michael came in with their flowers. "I want to see what it's like out there," he said. Sophie brought him tasty-smelling leaves to burn, which made the castle room smell as strongly as the bathroom, but Calcifer said what he really wanted was company. They went into the shop all day and left him alone, so Sophie made Michael serve in the shop for at least an hour every morning while she went and talked to Calcifer. She invented guessing games to keep Calcifer occupied when she was busy, but Calcifer was still discontented. "When are you going to break my contract with Howl?" he asked more and more often, and Sophie put Calcifer off. "I'm working on it," she said. "It won't be long now." This was not quite true. Sophie had stopped thinking of it unless she had to. When she put together what Mrs. Pentstemon had said with all the things Howl and Calcifer had said, she found she had some strong and rather terrible ideas about the contract. She was sure that breaking it would be the end of both Howl and Calcifer. Howl might deserve it, but Calcifer did not. And since Howl seemed to be working quite hard in order to slither out of the rest of the witch's curse, Sophie wanted to do nothing unless she could help. Sometimes Sophie thought it was simply that the dog man was getting her down. He was such a doleful creature. The only time he seemed to enjoy himself was when he chased down the green lanes between the bushes every morning. For the rest of the day he trudged gloomily about after Sophie, sighing deeply. As Sophie could do nothing about him either, she was rather glad when the dog man took to lying in patches of shade out in the yard, panting. Meanwhile, the roots Sophie had planted had become quite interesting. The onion had become a small palm tree and was sprouting little onion-scented nuts. Another root grew into a sort of pink sunflower. Only one was slow to grow. When it at last put out 2 round green leaves, Sophie could hardly wait to see what it would grow into. The next day, it looked as if it might be an orchid. It had pointed leaves spotted with mauve and a long green stalk growing out of the middle with a large bud on it. The day after that, Sophie left the fresh flowers in the tin bath and hurried eagerly to the alcove to see how it was getting on. The bud had opened into a pink flower like an orchid that had been through a mangle. It was flat and joined to the stalk just below a round tip. There were 4 petals sprouting from a plump pink middle, 2 pointing downward and 2 more halfway up that stuck out sideways. While Sophie stared at it, a strong scent of spring flowers warned her that Howl had come in and was standing behind her. "What is that thing?" he said. "If you were expecting an ultraviolet violet or an infrared geranium, you got it wrong, Mrs. Mad Scientist. It looks like a squash baby flower," Michael said, coming to look. It did too. Howl shot Michael an alarmed look and picked up the flower in its pot. He slid it out of the pot into his hand, where he carefully separated the white, thready roots and the soot and the remains of the manure spell until he uncovered the brown, forked root Sophie had grown it from. "I might have guessed," he said. "It's mandrake root." Sophie strikes again. "You do have a touch, don't you, Sophie?" He put the plant carefully back, passed it to Sophie, and went away, looking rather pale. So that was almost all the curse come true. Sophie thought as she went to arrange the fresh flowers in the shop window. The mandrake root had had a baby. That only left one more thing, the wind to advance an honest mind. If that meant Howl's mind had to be honest, Sophie thought, there was a chance that the curse might never come true. She told herself it served Howl right anyway, for going courting Miss Angorian every morning in a charmed suit, but she still felt alarmed and guilty. She arranged a sheaf of white lilies in a 7-league boot. She crawled into the window to get them just so, and she heard a regular clump, clump, clump from outside in the street. It was not the sound of a horse. It was the sound of a stick hitting the stones. Sophie's heart was behaving oddly even before she dared look out of the window. There, sure enough, came the scarecrow, hopping slowly and purposefully down the center of the street. The rags trailing from its outstretched arms were fewer and grayer, and the turnip of its face was withered into a look of determination, as if it had hopped ever since Howl hurled it away, until at last it had hopped its way back. Sophie was not the only one to be scared. The few people about that early were running away from the scarecrow as hard as they could run. But the scarecrow took no notice and hopped on. Sophie hid her face from it. "We're not here," she told it in a fierce whisper. "You don't know we're here. You can't find us. Hop away fast." The clump clump of the hopping stick slowed as the scarecrow neared the shop. Sophie wanted to scream for Howl, but all she seemed to be able to do was to go on repeating, "We're not here. Go away quickly." And the hopping speeded up just as she told it to, and the scarecrow hopped its way past the shop and on through Market Chipping. Sophie thought she was going to come over queer, but she seemed just to have been holding her breath. She took a deep breath and felt shaky with relief. If the scarecrow came back, she could send it away again. Howl had gone out when Sophie went into the castle room. He seemed awfully upset, Michael said. Sophie looked at the door. The knob was blacked down. Not that upset, she thought. Michael went out too to Cesari's that morning as Sophie was alone in the shop. It was very hot. The flowers wilted in spite of the spells, and very few people seemed to want to buy any. What with this, and the mandrake root, and the scarecrow, all Sophie's feelings seemed to come to a head. She was downright miserable. It may be the curse hovering to catch up with Howl, she sighed to the flowers, but I think it's being the eldest, really. Look at me. I set out to seek my fortune, and I end up exactly where I started, and old as the hills still. Here the dog man put his glossy red snout round the door to the yard and whined. Sophie sighed. Never an hour passed without the creature checking up on her. "Yes, I'm still here," she said. "Where did you expect me to be?" The dog came into the shop. He sat up and stretched his paws out stiffly in front of him. Sophie realized he was trying to turn into a man. Poor creature. She tried to be nice to him because he was, after all, worse off than she was. "Try harder," she said. "Put your back into it. You can be a man if you want." The dog stretched and straightened his back and strained, and just as Sophie was sure he was going to have to give up or topple over backward, he managed to rise to his hind legs and heave himself up into a distraught, ginger-haired man. "I envy Howl," he panted. "Does that so easily. I was dogging the hedge you helped. Told Letty I knew you. I keep watch. I was here before," and he began to double up again into a dog and howled with annoyance. "With witch in shop!" He wailed and fell forward onto his hands, growing a great deal of gray and white hair as he did so. Sophie stared at the large, shaggy dog that stood there. "You were with the witch," she said. She remembered now, the anxious, ginger-haired man who had stared at her in horror. "Then you know who I am, and you know I'm under a spell. Does Letty know too?" The huge, shaggy head nodded. "And she called you Gaston," Sophie remembered. "Oh, my friend, she has made it hard for you. Fancy having all that hair in this weather. You'd better go somewhere cool." The dog nodded again and shambled miserably into the yard. "But why did Letty send you?" Sophie wondered. She felt thoroughly put out and disturbed by this discovery. She went up the stairs and through the broom cupboard to talk to Calcifer. Calcifer was not much help. "It doesn't make any difference how many people know you're under a spell," he said. "It hasn't helped the dog much, has it?" "No, but—" Sophie began, but just then the castle door clicked and opened. Sophie and Calcifer looked. They saw the doorknob was still set to black down, and they expected Howl to come through it. It was hard to say which of them was more astonished when the person who slid rather cautiously round the door turned out to be Miss Angorian. Miss Angorian was equally astonished. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. "I thought Mr. Jenkins might be here." "He's out," Sophie said stiffly, and she wondered where Howl had gone, if not to see Miss Angorian. Miss Angorian let go of the door which she had been clutching in her surprise. She left it swinging open on nothing and came pleadingly towards Sophie. Sophie found she had got up herself and come across the room. It seemed as if she was trying to block Miss Angorian off. "Please," said Miss Angorian, "don't tell Mr. Jenkins I was here. To tell you the truth, I only encouraged him in hope of getting news of my fiancé, Ben Sullivan, you know. I'm positive Ben disappeared to the same place Mr. Jenkins keeps disappearing to, only Ben didn't come back." "There's no Mr. Sullivan here," Sophie said, and she thought, "That's Wizard Suleiman's name. I don't believe a word of it." "Oh, I know that," Miss Angorian said, "but this feels like the right place. Do you mind if I just look round a little to give myself some idea of the sort of life Ben's leading now?" She hooked her sheet of black hair behind one ear and tried to walk further into the room. Sophie stood in the way. This forced Miss Angorian to tiptoe, pleadingly away sideways toward the workbench. "How very quaint," she said, looking at the bottles and jars. "What a quaint little town," she said, looking out of the window. "It's called Market Chipping," Sophie said, and she moved round and herded Miss Angorian back towards the door. "And what's up those stairs?" Miss Angorian asked, pointing to the open door to the stairs. "Howl's private room," Sophie said firmly, walking Miss Angorian away backward. "And what's through that other open door?" Miss Angorian asked. "Shop," said Sophie. "Nosy Parker," she thought. By this time Miss Angorian either had to back into the chair or out through the door again. She stared at Calcifer in a vague, frowning way, as if she was not sure what she was seeing, and Calcifer simply stared back without saying a word. This made Sophie feel better about being so very unfriendly. Only people who understood Calcifer were really welcome in Howl's house. But now Miss Angorian made a dive round the chair and noticed Howl's guitar leaning in its corner. She snatched it up with a gasp and turned round, holding it to her chest possessively. "Ben had a guitar like this. It could be Ben's. I heard Howl bought it last winter," Sophie said. And she walked forwards again, trying to scoop Miss Angorian out of her corner and through the door. "Something's happened to Ben," Miss Angorian said throbbingly. "He would never have parted from his guitar." "Where is he? I know he can't be dead. I'd know in my heart if he were." Sophie wondered whether to tell Miss Angorian that the witch had caught Wizard Suleiman. She looked across to see where the human skull was. She had half a mind to wave it in Miss Angorian's face and say it was Wizard Suleiman's, but the skull was in the sink, hidden behind a bucket of spare ferns and lilies, and she knew that if she went over there, Miss Angorian would ooze out into the room again. Besides, it would be unkind. "May I take this guitar?" Miss Angorian said huskily, clutching it to her, "to remind me of Ben." The throb in Miss Angorian's voice annoyed Sophie. "No," she said, "there's no need to be so intense about it. You've no proof it was his." She hobbled close to Miss Angorian and seized the guitar by its neck. Miss Angorian stared at her over it with wide, anguished eyes. Sophie dragged. Miss Angorian hung on. The guitar gave out horrible, out-of-tune jangles. Sophie jerked it out of Miss Angorian's arms. "Don't be silly," she said. "You've no right to walk into people's castles and take their guitars. I've told you Mr. Sullivan's not here. Now go back to Wales. Go on." And she used the guitar to push Miss Angorian backward through the open door. Miss Angorian backed into the nothingness until half of her vanished. "You're hard," she said reproachfully. "Yes, I am," said Sophie, and slammed the door on her. She turned the knob to orange down to prevent Miss Angorian coming back and dumped the guitar back in its corner with a firm twang. "And don't you dare tell Howl she was here," she said unreasonably to Calcifer. "I bet she came to see Howl. The rest was just a pack of lies. Wizard Suleiman was settled here years ago. He probably came to get away from her beastly throbbing voice. I've never seen anyone got rid of so." This made Sophie feel both unkind and guilty. After all, she herself had walked into the castle in much the same way and had been twice as nosy as Miss Angorian. "Gah!" she said. She stumped into the bathroom and stared at her withered old face in the mirrors. She picked up one of the packets labeled "Skin" and then tossed it down again. Even young and fresh, she did not think her face compared particularly well with Miss Angorian's. "Gosh," she said, "dough!" She hobbled rapidly back and seized ferns and lilies from the sink. She hobbled with them, dripping, to the shop, where she rammed them into a bucket of nutrition spell. "Be daffodils," she told them in a mad, croaking voice. "Be daffodils in June, you beastly things." The dog man put his shaggy face round the yard door. When he saw the mood Sophie was in, he backed out again hurriedly. When Michael came merrily in with a large pie a minute later, Sophie gave him such a glare that Michael instantly remembered a spell Howl had asked him to make up and fled away through the broom cupboard. "Gah!" Sophie snarled after him. She bent over her bucket again. "Be daffodils! Be daffodils!" she croaked. It did not make her feel any better that she knew it was a silly way to behave, in which Sophie expresses her feelings with weed. Killer. Owl opened the door toward the end of the afternoon and sauntered in, whistling. He seemed to have got over the mandrake root. It did not make Sophie feel any better to find he had not gone to Wales after all. She gave him her very fiercest glare. "Merciful heavens," Howl said. "I think that turned me to stone. What's the matter?" Sophie only snarled. "What suit are you wearing?" Howl looked down at his black garments. "Does it matter?" "Yes," growled Sophie. "And don't give me that about being in mourning. Which one is it really?" Howl shrugged and held up one trailing sleeve as if he were not sure which it was. He stared at it, looking puzzled. The black color of it ran downward from his shoulder into the pointed hanging tip. His shoulder and the top of his sleeve grew brown, then gray, while the pointed tip turned inkier and inkier, until Howl was wearing a back suit with one blue and silver sleeve whose ends seemed to have been dipped in tar. "That one," he said, and let the black spread back up to his shoulder again. Sophie was somehow more annoyed than ever. She gave a wordless grump of rage. "Sophie," Howl said in his most laughing, pleading way. The dog man pushed open the yard door and shambled in. He never would let Howl talk to Sophie for long. Howl stared at it. "You've got an old English sheepdog now," he said, as if he was glad of the distraction. "2 dogs are going to take a lot of feeding. There's only 1 dog." Sophie said crossly, "He's under a spell." "He is?" said Howl, and he set off toward the dog with a speed that showed he was quite glad to get away from Sophie. This, of course, was the last thing the dog man wanted. He backed away. Howl pounced and caught him by 2 handfuls of shaggy hair before he could reach the door. "So he is," he said, and knelt down to look into what could be seen of the sheepdog's eyes. "Sophie," he said, "what do you mean by not telling me about this? This dog is a man, and he's in a terrible state." Howl whirled round on one knee, still holding the dog. Sophie looked into Howl's glass marble glare and realized that Howl was angry now, really angry. "Good. Sophie felt like a fight. You could have noticed for yourself," she said, glaring back, daring Howl to do his worst with green slime. "Anyway, the dog didn't want—" Howl was too angry to listen. He jumped up and hauled the dog across the tiles. "And so I would have done if I hadn't had things on my mind," he said. "Come on, I want you in front of Calcifer." The dog braced all 4 shaggy feet. Howl lugged at it, braced and sliding. "Michael!" he yelled. There was a particular sound to that yell which brought Michael running. "And did you know this dog was really a man?" Howl asked as he and Michael dragged the reluctant mountain of a dog up the stairs. "He's not, is he?" Michael asked, shocked and surprised. "Then I let you off and just blame Sophie," Howl said, hauling the dog through the broom cupboard. "Anything like this is always Sophie." "But you knew, didn't you, Calcifer?" he said as the two of them dragged the dog in front of the hearth. Calcifer retreated until he was bent backward against the chimney. "You never asked," he said. "Do I have to ask you?" Howl said. "All right, I should have noticed myself. But you disgust me, Calcifer. Compared with the way the witch treats her demon, you live a revoltingly easy life, and all I ask in return is that you tell me things I need to know. This is twice you've let me down. Now help me get this creature to its own shape this minute." Calcifer was an unusually sickly shade of blue. "All right," he said sulkily. The dogman tried to get away, but Howl got his shoulder under its chest and shoved so that it went up onto its hind legs willy-nilly. Then he and Michael held it there. "What's the silly creature holding out for?" Howl panted. "This feels like one of the Witch of the Wastes again, doesn't it?" "Yes, there are several layers of it," said Calcifer. "Let's get the dog part off anyway," said Howl. Calcifer surged to a deep roaring blue. Sophie, watching prudently from the door of the broom cupboard, saw the shaggy dog shape fade away inside the man shape. It faded to dog again, then back to man, blurred, then hardened. Finally, Howl and Michael were each holding the arm of a ginger-haired man in a crumpled brown suit. Sophie was not surprised. She had not recognized him. Apart from his anxious look, his face was almost totally lacking in personality. "Now, who are you, my friend?" Howl asked him. The man put his hands up and shakily felt his face. I'm not sure." The most recent name he answered to was. The man looked at Calcifer as if he wished Calcifer did not know this. "Did I?" he said. "Then we'll call you Percival for now," Howl said. He turned the ex-dog round and sat him in the chair. "Sit there and take it easy, and tell us what you do remember. By the feel of you, the witch had you for some time." "Yes," said Percival, rubbing his face again. "She took my head off. To remember being on a shelf, looking at the rest of me." Michael was astonished. "But you'd be dead," he protested. "Not necessarily," said Howl. "You haven't gotten to that sort of witchcraft yet, but I could take any piece of you I wanted and leave the rest of you alive if I went about it the right way." He frowned at the ex-dog. "But I'm not sure the witch put this one back together properly." Calcifer, who was obviously trying to prove that he was working hard for Howl, said, "This man is incomplete, and he has parts from some other man." Percival looked more distraught than ever. "Don't alarm him, Calcifer," Howl said. "He must feel bad enough anyway. Do you know why the witch took your head off, my friend?" he asked Percival. "No," said Percival, "I don't remember anything." Michael was suddenly seized with the most exciting idea. He leaned over Percival and asked, "Did you ever answer to the name of Justin or your Royal Highness?" Sophie snorted again. She knew this was ridiculous even before Percival said, "No, the witch called me Gaston, but that isn't my name." "Don't crowd him, Michael," said Howl, "and don't make Sophie snort again. In the mood she's in, she'll bring down the castle next time." Though that seemed to mean Howl was no longer angry, Sophie found she was angrier than ever. She stumped off into the shop, where she banged about, shutting the shop and putting things away for the night. She went to look at her daffodils. Something had gone horribly wrong with them. They were wet brown things trailing out of a bucket full of the poisonous-smelling liquid she had ever come across. "Oh, confound it all!" Sophie yelled. "What's all this now?" said Howl, arriving in the shop. He bent over the bucket and sniffed. "You seem to have some rather efficient weed killer here. How about trying it on those weeds on the drive of the mansion?" "I will," said Sophie. "I feel like killing something." She slammed around until she had found a watering can and stumped through into the castle with the can in the bucket, where she hurled open the door orange down onto the mansion drive. Percival looked up anxiously. They had given him the guitar, rather as you gave a baby a rattle, and he was sitting making horrible twangings. "You go with her, Percival," Howl said. The mood she's in, she'll be killing all the trees, too. So Percival laid down the guitar and took the bucket carefully out of Sophie's hand. Sophie stumped out into a golden summer evening at the end of the valley. Everyone had been much too busy up to now to pay much attention to the mansion. It was much grander than Sophie had realized. It had a weedy terrace with statues along the edge and steps down to the drive. When Sophie looked back on the pretext of telling Percival to hurry up, she saw the house was very big, with more statues along the roof and rows of windows. But it was derelict. Green mildew ran down the peeling wall from every window. Many of the windows were broken, and the shutters that should have folded against the walls beside them were gray and blistered and hanging sideways. "Huh," said Sophie. "I think the least Howl could do is to make the place look a bit more lived in." "But no, he's far too busy gadding off to Wales. Don't just stand there, Percival. Pour some of that stuff into the can and then come along behind me." Percival meekly did as she said. He was no fun at all to bully. Sophie suspected that was why Howl had sent him with her. She snorted and took her anger out on the weeds. Whatever the stuff was that killed the daffodils, it was strong. The weeds in the drive died as soon as it touched them. So did the grass at the sides of the drive. Until Sophie calmed down a little, the evening calmed her. The fresh air was blowing off the distant hills, and clumps of trees planted at the sides of the drive rustled majestically in it. Sophie weed-killed her way down a quarter of the drive. "You remember a great deal more than you let on," she accused Percival while he refilled her can. "What did the witch really want with you? Why did she bring you into the shop with her that time?" "She wanted to find out about Howl," Percival said. "How?" said Sophie. "But you didn't know him, did you?" "No, but I must have known something. It had to do with the curse she'd put on him," Percival explained, "but I've no idea what it was. She took it, you see, after we came to the shop. I feel bad about that. I was trying to stop her knowing, because a curse is an evil thing, and I did it by thinking about Letty. Letty was just in my head. I don't know how I knew her, because Letty said she'd never seen me when I went to Upper Folding, but I knew all about her enough so that when the witch made me tell her about Letty, I said she kept a hat shop in Market Chipping. So the witch went there to teach us both a lesson, and you were there. She thought you were Letty. I was horrified because I didn't know Letty had a sister." Sophie picked up the can and weed-killed generously, wishing the weeds were the witch. "And she turned you into a dog straight after that?" "Just outside the town," said Percival. As soon as I'd let her know what she wanted, she opened the carriage door and said, "Off you run. I'll call you when I need you." And I ran because I could feel some sort of spell following me. It caught up with me just as I got to a farm, and the people there saw me change into a dog and thought I was a werewolf and tried to kill me. I had to bite one to get away, but I couldn't get rid of the stick, and it stuck in the hedge when I tried to get through. Sophie weed-killed her way down Anther Curve of the drive as she listened. "Then you went to Mrs. Fairfax's?" "Yes, I was looking for Letty. They were both very kind to me," Percival said, even though they'd never seen me before. "And Wizard Howl kept visiting to court Letty. Letty didn't want him, and she asked me to bite him to get rid of him, until Howl suddenly began asking her about you, and Sophie narrowly missed weed-killing her shoes. Since the gravel was smoking where the stuff met it, this was probably just as well." "What?" He said, "I know someone called Sophie who looks a little like you." And Letty said, "That's my sister," without thinking, Percival said. And she got terribly worried then, particularly as Howl went on asking about her sister. Letty said she could have bitten her tongue off. The day you came there, she was being nice to Howl in order to find out how he knew you. Howl said you were an old woman, and Mrs. Fairfax said she'd seen you." Letty cried and cried. She said, "Something terrible has happened to Sophie, and the worst of it is she'll think she's safe from Howl. Sophie's too kind herself to see how heartless Howl is, and she was so upset that I managed to turn into a man long enough to say I'd go and keep an eye on you." Sophie sprayed weed killer in a great smoking arc. "Bother Letty. It's very kind of her, and I love her dearly for it." I've been quite as worried about her. But I do not need a watchdog." "Yes, you do," said Percival. "Or you did. I arrived far too late." Sophie swung round, weed killer and all. Percival had to leap into the grass and run for his life behind the nearest tree. The grass died in a long brown swathe behind him as he ran. "Curse everyone!" Sophie cried out. "I've done with a lot of you." She dumped the smoking watering can in the middle of the drive and marched off through the weeds toward the stone gateway. "Too late," she muttered as she marched. "What nonsense! Howl's not only heartless, he's impossible. Besides," she added, "I am an old woman." But she could not deny that something had been wrong ever since the moving castle moved, or even before that, and it seemed to tie up with the way Sophie seemed to mysteriously unable to face either of her sisters. "And all the things I told the king are true," she went on. She was going to match 7 leagues on her own 2 feet and not come back. Show everyone. Who cared that poor Mrs. Penstemon had relied on Sophie to stop Howl from going to the bad? Sophie was a failure anyway. It came of being the eldest, and Mrs. Penstemon had thought Sophie was Howl's loving old mother anyway, hadn't she? Or had she? Uneasily, Sophie realized that a lady whose trained eye could detect a charm sewn into a suit could surely even more easily detect the stronger magic of the witch's spell. "Oh, confound that gray and scarlet suit," Sophie said. "I refuse to believe that I was the one that got caught with it." The trouble was the blue and silver suit seemed to have worked just the same. She stumped a few steps further. "Anyway," she said with great relief, "Howl doesn't like me." This reassuring thought would have been enough to keep Sophie walking all night had not a sudden familiar uneasiness swept over her. Her ears had caught a distant tock, tock, tock. She looked sharply under the low sun, and there, on the road which wound away behind the stone gate, was a distant figure with outstretched arms, hopping, hopping. Sophie picked up her skirts, whirled around, and sped back the way she had come. Dust and gravel flew up round her in clouds. Percival was standing forlornly in the drive beside the bucket and the watering can. Sophie seized him and dragged him behind the nearest tree. "Is something wrong?" he said. "Quiet! It's that dratted scarecrow again," Sophie gasped. She shut her eyes. "We're not here," she said. "You can't find us. Go away, fast, fast, fast." "But why?" said Percival. "Shut up!" "Not here, not here, not here," Sophie said desperately. She opened one eye. The scarecrow, almost between the gateposts, was standing still, swaying uncertainly. "That's right," said Sophie. "We're not here. Go away fast, twice as fast, 3 times as fast, 10 times as fast. Go away." And the scarecrow hesitantly swayed round on its stick and began to hop back up the road. After the first few hops, it was going in giant leaps, faster and faster, just as Sophie had told it to. Sophie hardly breathed, and did not let go of Percival's sleeve until the scarecrow was out of sight. "What's wrong with it?" said Percival. "Why didn't you want it?" Sophie shuddered. Since the scarecrow was out on the road, she did not dare leave now. She picked up the watering can and stumped back to the mansion. A fluttering caught her eye as she went. She looked up at the building. The flutter was from long white curtains blowing from an open French window beyond the statues of the terrace. The statues were now clean white stone, and she could see curtains at most of the windows and glass too. The shutters were now folded properly beside them, newly painted white. Not a green stain nor a blister marked the new creamy plaster of the house front. The front door was a masterpiece of black paint and gold scroll work, centering on a gilded lion with a ring in its mouth for a door knocker. "Huh," said Sophie. She resisted the temptation to go in through the open window and explore. That was what Howl wanted her to do. She marched straight to the front door, seized the golden doorknob, and threw the door open with a crash. Howl and Michael were at the bench hastily dismantling a spell. Part of it must have been to change the mansion, but the rest, as Sophie well knew, had to be a listening-in spell of some kind. As Sophie stormed in, both their faces shot nervously round toward her. Calcifer instantly plunged down under his logs. "Keep behind me, Michael," said Howl. Eavesdropper, Sophie shouted. Snooper, what's wrong? Howl said. Do you want the shutters black and gold too? You bareface. Sophie stuttered. That wasn't the only thing you heard. How long have you known I am under a spell? Said Howl. Well, now. I told him, Michael said, looking nervously round Howl. My Letty, you, Sophie shrieked. The other Letty let the cat out of the bag too, Howl said quickly. You know she did, and Mrs. Fairfax talked a great deal that day. There was a time when everyone seemed to be telling me, even Calcifer did, when I asked him, but did you honestly think I don't know my own business well enough not to spot a strong spell like that when I see it? I had several goes at taking it off you when you weren't looking, but nothing seems to work. I took you to Mrs. Pentstemon, hoping she could do something, but she evidently couldn't. I came to the conclusion that you like being in disguise. Disguise? Sophie yelled. Howl laughed at her. It must be, since you're doing it yourself, he said. What a strange family you are. Is your name really Letty too? This was too much for Sophie. Percival edged nervously in just then, carrying the half-full bucket of weed killer. Sophie dropped her can, seized the bucket from him, and threw it at Howl. Howl ducked. Michael dodged the bucket. The weed killer went up in a sheet of sizzling green flame from floor to ceiling. The bucket clanged into the sink, where all the remaining flowers died instantly. Ow, said Calcifer from under his logs. That was strong. Howl carefully picked the skull out from under the smoking brown remains of the flowers and dried it on one of his sleeves. Of course it was strong, he said. Sophie never does things by halves. The skull, as Howl wiped it, became bright new white, and the sleeve he was using developed a faded blue and silver patch. Howl set the skull on the bench and looked at his sleeve ruefully. Sophie had half a mind to stump straight out of the castle again and away down the drive, but there was that scarecrow. She settled for stumping to the chair instead, where she sat and fell into a deep sulk. I'm not going to speak to any of them, she thought. Sophie, Howl said, I did my best. Haven't you noticed that your aches and pains have been better lately, or do you enjoy having those too? Sophie did not answer. Howl gave her up and turned to Percival. I'm glad to see you have some brain after all, he said. You had me worried. I really don't remember very much, Percival said. But he stopped behaving like a half-wit. He picked the guitar up and tuned it. He had it sounding much nicer in seconds. My sorrow revealed, Howl said pathetically. I was born an unmusical Welshman. Did you tell Sophie all of it? Or do you really know what the witch was trying to find out? She wanted to know about Wales, said Percival. I thought that was it, Howl said soberly. Ah, well, he went away into the bathroom where he was gone for the next 2 hours. During that time, Percival played a number of tunes on the guitar in a slow, thoughtful way, as if he was teaching himself how to, while Michael crawled about the floor with a smoking rag, trying to get rid of the weed killer. Sophie sat in the chair and said not a word. Calcifer kept bobbing up and peeping at her and going down again under his logs. Howl came out of the bathroom with his suit glossy black, his hair glossy white, in a cloud of steam smelling of gentians. I may be back quite late, he said to Michael. It's going to be Midsummer Day after midnight, and the witch may well try something. So keep all the defenses up, and remember all I told you, please. All right, Michael said, putting the steaming remains of the rag in the sink. Howl turned to Percival. I think I know what's happened to you, he said. It's going to be a fair job sorting you out, but I'll have a go tomorrow after I get back. Howl went to the door and stopped, with his hand still on the knob. Sophie, are you still not talking to me? He asked miserably. Sophie knew Howl could sound unhappy in heaven if it suited him, and he had just used her to get information out of Percival. No, she snarled. Howl sighed and went out. Sophie looked up and saw that the knob was pointing black down. That does it, she thought. I don't care if it is Midsummer Day tomorrow. I'm leaving, in which Sophie finds further difficulties in leaving the castle. Midsummer Day dawned about the same moment that it did, Howl crashed in through the door with such noise that Sophie shot up in her cubbyhole, convinced that the witch was hot on his heels. "They think so much about me that they always play without me," Howl bellowed. Sophie realized that he was only trying to sing Calcifer's saucepan song and lay down again, whereupon Howl fell over the chair and caught his foot in the stool so that it shot across the room. After that, he tried to go upstairs through the broom cupboard and then the yard. This seemed to puzzle him a little, but finally he discovered the stairs, all except the bottom one, and fell up them on his face. The whole castle shook. "What's the matter?" Sophie asked, sticking her head through the banister. "Rugby club reunion," Howl replied with thick dignity. "Didn't know I used to fly up the wing for my university, did you, Mrs. Knowles?" "If you were trying to fly, you must have forgotten how," Sophie said. "I was born to strange sights," said Howl, "things invisible to see, and I was just on my way to bed when you interrupted me. I know where all the past years are, and who cleft the devil's foot." "Go to bed, you fool," Calcifer said sleepily. "You're drunk." "Who, me?" said Howl. "I assure you, my friends, that I am Cone-Souled Stober." He got up and stalked upstairs, feeling for the wall as if he thought it might escape him unless he kept in touch with it. His bedroom door did escape him. "What a lie that was," Howl remarked as he walked into the wall. "My shining dishonesty will be the salvation of me." He walked into the wall several times more, in several different places, before he discovered his bedroom door and crashed his way through it. Sophie could hear him falling about, saying that his bed was dodging. "He is quite impossible," Sophie said, and she decided to leave at once. Unfortunately, the noise Howl made woke Michael up, and Percival, who was sleeping on the floor in Michael's room. Michael came downstairs saying that they were so thoroughly awake that they might as well go out and gather the flowers for the midsummer garlands while the day was still cool. Sophie was not sorry to go out into the place of flowers for one last time. There was a warm, milky haze out there, filled with the scent and half-hidden colors. Sophie thumped along, testing the squashy ground with her stick and listening to the whirrings and twitters of the thousands of birds, feeling truly regretful. She stroked a moist satin lily and fingered one of the ragged purple flowers with long, powdery stamens. She looked back at the tall black castle, breathing the mist behind them. She sighed. "He made it much better," Percival remarked, as he put an armful of hibiscus into Michael's floating bath. "Who did?" said Michael. "How?" said Percival. "There were only bushes at first, and they were quite small and dry. You remember being here before?" Michael asked excitedly. He had by no means given up his idea that Percival might be Prince Justin. "I think I was here with the witch," Percival said doubtfully. They fetched 2 bathloads of flowers. Sophie noticed that when they came in the second time, Michael spun the knob over the door several times. That must have something to do with keeping the witch out. Then, of course, there were the midsummer garlands to make. That took a long time. Sophie had meant to leave Michael and Percival to do that, but Michael was too busy asking Percival cunning questions, and Percival was very slow at the work. Sophie knew what made Michael excited. There was a sort of air about Percival, as if he expected something to happen soon. It made Sophie wonder just how much in the power of the witch he still was. She had to make most of the garlands. Any thought she might have had about staying and helping Howl against the witch vanished. Howl, who could have made all the garlands just by waving his hand, was now snoring so loudly she could hear him right through the shop. They were so long making the garlands that it was time to open the shop before they had finished. Michael fetched them bread and honey, and they ate while they dealt with the tremendous first rush of customers. Although Midsummer Day, in the way of holidays, had turned out to be a gray and chilly day in market shipping, half the town came dressed in fine holiday clothes to buy flowers and garlands for the festival. There was the usual jostling crowd out in the street. So many people came into the shop that it was getting on midday before Sophie finally stole away up the stairs and through the broom cupboard. They had taken so much money, Sophie thought as she stole about, packing up some food and her old clothes in a bundle that Michael's hoard under the hearthstone would be 10 times the size. "Have you come to talk to me?" asked Calcifer. "In a moment," Sophie said, crossing room with her bundle behind her back. She did not want Calcifer raising an outcry about that contract. She stretched out her hand to unhook her stick from the chair, and somebody knocked at the door. Sophie, stuck with her hand stretched out, looked inquiringly at Calcifer. "It's the mansion door," said Calcifer. "Flesh and blood and harmless." The knocking came again. "This always happens when I try to leave," Sophie thought. She turned the knob orange down and opened the door. There was a carriage in the drive beyond the statues, pulled by a goodish pair of horses. Sophie could see it round the edges of the very large footman who had been doing the knocking. "Mrs. Sacheverell Smith, to call upon the new occupants," said the footman. "How very awkward," Sophie thought. It was the result of Howl's new paint and curtains. "We're not at," she began. But Mrs. Sacheverell Smith swept the footman aside and came in. "Wait with the carriage, Theobald," she said to the footman as she sailed past Sophie, folding her parasol. It was Fanny, looking wonderfully prosperous in cream silk. She was wearing the cream silk hat trimmed with roses, which Sophie remembered only too well. She remembered what she had said to that hat as she trimmed it, "You are going to have to marry money," and it was quite clear from the look of her that Fanny had. "Oh dear," said Fanny, looking round. "There must be some mistake. This is the servants' quarters." "Well, we're not quite moved in yet, madam," Sophie said, and wondered how Fanny would feel if she knew that the old hat shop was only just beyond the broom cupboard. Fanny turned round and gaped at Sophie. "Sophie!" she exclaimed. "Oh, good gracious, child, what's happened to you? You look about 90. Have you been very ill?" And to Sophie's surprise, Fanny threw aside her hat and her parasol and all of her grand manner and flung her arms round Sophie and wept. "Oh, I didn't know what had happened to you," she sobbed. "I went to Martha and I sent to Letty, and neither of them knew. They changed places, silly girls, did you know? But nobody knew a thing about you. I've reward out still, and here you are, working as a servant, when you could be living in luxury up the hill with me and Mr. Smith." Sophie found she was crying as well. She hurriedly dropped her bundle and led Fanny to the chair. She pulled the stool up and sat beside Fanny, holding her hand. By this time they were both laughing as well as crying. They were most powerfully glad to see one another again. "It's a long story," Sophie said after Fanny had asked her 6 times what happened to her. "When I looked in the mirror and saw myself like this, it was such a shock that I sort of wandered away." "Overwork?" Fanny said wretchedly. "How I've blamed myself." "Not really," said Sophie, "and you mustn't worry because Wizard Howl took me in." "Wizard Howl!" exclaimed Fanny. "That wicked, wicked man! Has he done this to you? Where is he? Let me at him." She seized her parasol and became so very warlike that Sophie had to hold her down. Sophie did not care to think how Howl might react if Fanny woke him by stabbing him with her parasol. "No, no," she said. "Howl has been very kind to me." And this was true, Sophie realized. Howl showed his kindness rather strangely, but considering all Sophie had done to annoy him, he had been very good to her indeed. "But they say he eats women alive," Fanny said, still struggling to get up. Sophie held down her waving parasol. "He doesn't really," she said. "Do listen. He's not wicked at all." There was a bit of a fizz from the grate at this, where Calcifer was watching with some interest. "He isn't," Sophie said to Calcifer as much as to Fanny. "In all the time I've been here, I've not seen him work a single evil spell," which again was true, she knew. "Then I have to believe you," Fanny said, relaxing, "though I'm sure it must be your doing if he's reformed. You always did have a way with you, Sophie. You could stop Martha's tantrums when I couldn't do a thing with her, and I always said it was thanks to you that Letty only got her way half of the time instead of all the time. But you should have told me where you were, love." Sophie knew she should have. She had taken Martha's view of Fanny, whole and entire, when she should have known Fanny better. She was ashamed. Fanny could not wait to tell Sophie about Mr. Sacheverell Smith. She launched into a long and excited account of how she had met Mr. Smith the very week Sophie had left, and married him before the week was out. Sophie watched her as she talked. Being old gave her an entirely new view of Fanny. She was a lady who was still young and pretty, and she had found the hat shop as boring as Sophie did. But she had stuck with it and done her best, both with the shop and the 3 girls until Mr. Hatter died. Then she had suddenly been afraid she was just like Sophie, old with no reason and nothing to show for it. And then, with you not being there to pass it on to, there seemed no reason not to sell the sock, Fanny was saying, when there was a clatter of feet in the broom cupboard. Michael came through saying, "We've shut the shop, and look who's here." He was holding Martha's hand. Martha was thinner and fairer and almost looked like herself again. She let go of Michael and rushed at Sophie, shouting, "Sophie, you should have told me," while she flung her arms round her. Then she flung her arms round Fanny, just as if she had never said all those things about her. But this was not all. Letty and Mrs. Fairfax came through the cupboard after Martha, carrying a hamper between them, and after them came Percival, who looked livelier than Sophie had ever seen him. "We came over by carrier at first light," Mrs. Fairfax said, "and we brought, bless me, it's Fanny." She dropped her end of the hamper and ran to hug Fanny. Letty dropped her end and ran to hug Sophie. In fact, there was such general hugging and exclaiming and shouting that Sophie thought it was a marvel Howl did not wake up. But she could hear him snoring even through the shouting. "I shall have to leave this evening," she thought. She was too glad to see everyone to consider leaving before that. Letty was very fond of Percival. While Michael carried the hamper to the bench and unpacked cold chickens and wines and honey puddings from it, Letty hung on to Percival's arm in an owner-like way that Sophie could not quite approve of, and made him tell her all he remembered. Percival did not seem to mind. Letty looked so lovely that Sophie did not blame him. He just arrived and kept turning into a man and then into different dogs and insisting that he knew me, Letty said to Sophie. "I knew. I'd never seen him before, but it didn't matter." She patted Percival's shoulder as if he was still a dog. "But you had met Prince Justin," Sophie said. "Oh, yes," Letty said offhandedly. "Mind you, he was in disguise in a green uniform, but it was obviously him. He was so smooth and courtly, even when he was annoyed about the finding spells. I had to make him up 2 lots because they would keep showing that Wizard Suleiman was somewhere between us and Market Chipping. And he swore that couldn't be true. And all the time I was doing them, he kept interrupting me, calling me sweet lady in a sarcastic sort of way, and asking me who I was and where my family lived and how old I was. I thought it was cheek. I'd rather have Wizard Howl, and that's saying something." By this time everyone was milling about, eating chicken and sipping wine. Calcifer seemed to be shy. He had gone down to Green Flickers and nobody seemed to notice him. Sophie wanted him to meet Letty. She tried to coax him out. "Is that really the demon who has charge of Howl's life?" Letty said, looking down at the Green Flickers rather disbelievingly. Sophie looked up to assure Letty that Calcifer was real and saw Miss Angorian standing by the door, looking shy and uncertain. "Oh, do excuse me. I've come at a bad time, haven't I?" Miss Angorian said. "I just wanted to talk to Howl." Sophie stood up, not quite sure what to do. She was ashamed of the way she had driven Miss Angorian out before. It was only because she knew Howl was courting Miss Angorian. On the other hand, that did not mean she had to like her. Michael took things out of Sophie's hands by greeting Miss Angorian with a beaming smile and a shout of welcome. "Howl's asleep at the moment," he said. "Come and have a glass of wine while you wait." "How kind," said Miss Angorian. But it was plain that Miss Angorian was not happy. She refused wine and wandered nervously about, nibbling at a leg of chicken. The room was full of people who all knew one another very well, and she was the outsider. Fanny did not help by turning full non-stop talk with Mrs. Fairfax and saying, "What peculiar clothes!" Martha did not help either. She had seen how admiringly Michael had greeted Miss Angorian. She went and made sure that Michael did not talk to anyone but herself and Sophie. And Letty ignored Miss Angorian and went to sit on the stairs with Percival. Miss Angorian seemed rather quickly to decide that she had had enough. Sophie saw her at the door trying to open it. She hurried over, feeling very guilty. After all, Miss Angorian must have felt strongly about Howl to have come here at all. "Please don't go yet," Sophie said. "I'll go and wake Howl up." "Oh, no, you mustn't do that," Miss Angorian said, smiling nervously. "I've got a day off, and I'm quite happy to wait. I thought I'd go and explore outside. It's rather stuffy in here with that funny green fire burning." This seemed to Sophie the perfect way to get rid of Miss Angorian without really getting rid of her. She politely opened the door for her. Somehow, maybe it had to do with the defenses Howl had asked Michael to keep up, the knob had got turned round to purple down. Outside was a misty blaze of sun and the drifting banks of red and purple flowers. "What gorgeous rhododendrons!" Miss Angorian exclaimed in her huskiest and most throbbing voice. "I must look!" She sprang eagerly down into the marshy grass. "Don't go toward the southeast," Sophie called after her. The castle was drifting off sideways. Miss Angorian buried her beautiful face in a cluster of white flowers. "I won't go far at all," she said. "Good gracious," Fanny said, coming up behind Sophie. "Whatever has happened to my carriage?" Sophie explained as far as she could. But Fanny was so worried that Sophie had to turn the door orange down and open it to show the mansion drive in a much grayer day, where the footman and Fanny's coachman was sitting on the roof of the carriage, eating cold sausage and playing cards. Only then would Fanny believe that her carriage had not been mysteriously spirited away. Sophie was trying to explain, without really knowing herself, how one door could open on several different places, when Calcifer surged up from his logs, roaring. "Howl!" he roared, filling the chimney with blue flame. "Howl! Howl Jenkins! The witch has found your sister's family!" There were two violent thumps overhead. Howl's bedroom door crashed and Howl came tearing downstairs. Letty and Percival were hurled out of his way. Fanny screamed faintly at the sight of him. Howl's hair was like a haystack and there were red rims round his eyes. "Got me on my weak flank, blaster!" he shouted as he shot across the room with his black sleeves flying. "I was afraid she would. Thanks, Calcifer." He shoved Fanny aside and hauled open the door. Sophie heard the door bang behind Howl as she hobbled upstairs. She knew it was nosy, but she had to see what happened. As she hobbled through Howl's bedroom, she heard everyone else following her. "What a filthy room!" Fanny exclaimed. Sophie looked out the window. It was drizzling in the neat garden. The swing was hung with drops. The witch's waving mane of red hair was all dewed with it. She stood leaning against the swing, tall and commanding in her red robes, beckoning and beckoning again. Howl's niece, Mari, was shuffling over the wet grass toward the witch. She did not look as if she wanted to go, but she seemed to have no choice. Behind her, Howl's nephew Neil was shuffling toward the witch even more slowly, glowering in his most ferocious way. And Howl's sister Megan was behind the two children. Sophie could see Megan's arms gesturing and Megan's mouth opening and shutting. She was clearly giving the witch a piece of her mind, but she was being drawn toward the witch too. Howl burst out onto the lawn. He had not bothered to alter his clothes. He did not bother to do any magic. He just charged straight at the witch. The witch made a grab for Mari, but Mari was still too far away. Howl got to Mari first, slung her behind him and charged on, and the witch ran. She ran, like a cat with a dog after it, across the lawn and over the neat fence, in a flurry of flame-colored robes, with Howl, like the chasing dog, a foot or so behind and closing. The witch vanished over the fence in a red blur. Howl went after her in a black blur with trailing sleeves. Then the fence hid both of them from sight. "I hope he catches her," said Martha. "The little girl's crying." Down below, Megan put her arm round Mari and took both children indoors. There was no knowing what had happened to Howl and the witch. Letty and Percival and Martha and Michael went back downstairs. Fanny and Mrs. Fairfax were transfixed with disgust at the state of Howl's bedroom. "Look at those spiders," Mrs. Fairfax said. "And the dust on these curtains," said Fanny. "Annabel, I saw some brooms in that passage you came through." "Let's get them," said Mrs. Fairfax. "I'll pin that dress up for you, Fanny, and we'll get to work. I can't bear a room to be in this state. Oh, poor Howl," Sophie thought. "He does love those spiders." She hovered on the stairs, wondering how to stop Mrs. Fairfax and Fanny. From downstairs, Michael called, "Sophie, we're going to look round the mansion. Want to come?" That seemed the ideal thing to stop the two ladies from cleaning. Sophie called to Fanny and hobbled hurriedly downstairs. Letty and Percival were already opening the door. Letty had not listened when Sophie explained it to Fanny, and it was clear that Percival did not understand either. Sophie saw they were opening it purple down by mistake. They got it open as Sophie hobbled across the room to put them right. The scarecrow loomed up in the doorway against the flowers. "Shut it!" Sophie screamed. She saw what had happened. She had actually helped the scarecrow last night by telling it to go 10 times as fast. It had simply sped to the castle entrance and tried to get in there. But Miss Angorian was out there. Sophie wondered if she was lying in the bushes in a dead faint. "No, don't," she said weakly. No one was attending to her anyway. Letty's face was the color of Fanny's dress, and she was clutching Martha. Percival was standing and staring, and Michael was trying to catch the skull, which was yattering its teeth so hard that it was threatening to fall off the bench and take a wine bottle with it. And the skull seemed to have a strange effect on the guitar, too. It was giving out long, humming twangs. "Noom harem, noom harem," Calcifer flamed up the chimney again. "The thing is speaking," he said to Sophie. "It is saying it means no harm. I think it is speaking the truth. It is waiting for your permission to come in." Certainly the scarecrow was just standing there. It was not trying to barge inside as it had before, and Calcifer must have trusted it. He had stopped the castle moving. Sophie looked at the turnip face and the fluttering rags. It was not so frightening after all. She had once had fellow feeling for it. She rather suspected that she had made it into a convenient excuse for not leaving the castle because she had really wanted to stay. Now there was no point. Sophie had to leave anyway. Howl preferred Miss Angorian. "Please come in," she said a little croakily. Said the guitar. The scarecrow surged into the room with one powerful sideways hop. It stood swinging about on its one leg as if it was looking for something. The smell of flowers it had brought in with it did not hide its own smell of dust and rotting turnip. The skull yatted under Michael's fingers again. The scarecrow spun round, gladly, and fell sideways toward it. Michael made one attempt to rescue the skull, and then got hastily out of the way. For as the scarecrow fell across the bench, there came a fizzing jolt of strong magic, and the skull melted into the scarecrow's turnip head. It seemed to get inside the turnip and fill it out. There was now a strong suggestion of a rather craggy face on the turnip. The trouble was it was on the back side of the scarecrow. The scarecrow gave a wooden scramble, hopped upright uncertainly, and then swiftly spun its body round so that the front of it was under the craggy turnip face. Slowly it eased its outstretched arms down to its sides. "Can speak," it said in a somewhat mushy voice. "I may faint," Fanny announced on the stairs. "Nonsense," Mrs. Fairfax said behind Fanny. "The thing's only a magician's golem. It has to do what it was sent to do. They're quite harmless." Letty, all the same, looked ready to faint, but the only one who did faint was Percival. He flopped to the floor quite quietly and lay curled up as if he were asleep. Letty, in spite of her terror, ran toward him, only to back away as the scarecrow gave another hop and stood itself in front of Percival. "This is one of the parts I was sent to find," it said in its mushy voice. It swung on its stick until it was facing Sophie. "I must thank you," it said. "My skull was far away and I ran out of strength before I reached it. I would have lain in that hedge forever if you had not come and talked life into me." It swiveled to Mrs. Fairfax and then to Letty. "I thank you both too," it said. "Who sent you? What are you supposed to do?" Sophie said. The Scarecrow swung about uncertainly. "More than this," it said. "There are still part missing." Everyone waited, most of them too shaken to speak, while the Scarecrow rotated this way and that, seemingly thinking. "What is Percival a part of?" Sophie said. "Let it collect itself," said Calcifer. "No one's asked it to explain itself." He suddenly stopped speaking and shrank until barely a green flame showed. Michael and Sophie exchanged alarmed glances. Then a new voice spoke out of nowhere. It was enlarged and muffled as if it were speaking in a box, but it was unmistakably the voice of the witch. "Michael Fisher," it said, "tell your master, Howl, that he fell for my decoy. I now have woman called Lily Angorian in my fortress in the waste. Tell him I will only let her go if he himself comes to fetch her. Is that clear, Michael Fisher?" The Scarecrow whirled round and hopped for the open door. "Oh, no!" Michael cried out. "Stop it! The witch must have sent it so that she could get it in here." "In which a contract is concluded before witnesses." All people ran after the Scarecrow. Sophie ran the other way, through the broom cupboard into the shop, grabbing her stick as she went. "This is my fault," she muttered. "I have a genius for doing things wrong. I could have kept Miss Angorian indoors. I only needed to talk to her politely, poor thing. Howl may have forgiven me a lot of things, but he's not going to forgive me this in a hurry." In the flower shop she hauled the 7-league boots out of the window display and emptied hibiscus roses and water out of them onto the floor. She unlocked the shop door and towed the wet boots out onto the crowded pavement. "Excuse me?" she said to various shoes and trailing sleeves that were walking in her way. She looked up at the sun, which was not easy to find in the cloudy gray sky. "Let's see, southeast, that way. Excuse me," she said, clearing a small space for the boots among the holiday makers. She put them down, pointing the right way. She stepped into them and began to stride. Zip, 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 zip. It was as quick as that, and even more blurred and breathless in both boots than in one. Sophie had brief glimpses between long double strides of the mansion down at the end of the valley, gleaming between trees, with Fanny's carriage at the door, of bracken on a hillside, of a small river acing down into a green valley, of the same river sliding in a much broader valley, of the same valley turned so wide it seemed endless and blue in the distance, and a towery pile far, far off that might have been Kingsbury, of the plain narrowing toward mountains again, of a mountain which slanted so deeply under her boot that she stumbled in spite of her stick, which stumble brought her to the edge of a deep blue-misted gorge, with the tops of trees far below, where she had to take another stride or fall in, and she landed in crumbly yellow sand. She dug her stick in and looked carefully round. Behind her right shoulder, some miles off, a white, steamy mist almost hid the mountains she had just zipped through. Below the mist was a band of dark green. Sophie nodded. Though she could not see the moving castle this far away, she was sure that mist marked the place of flowers. She took another careful stride. Zip! It was a fearsomely hot day. The clay-yellow sand stretched in all directions now, shimmering in the heat. Rocks lay about in a messy way. The only growing things were occasional dismal gray bushes. The mountains looked like clouds coming up on the horizon. "If this is the waste," Sophie said, with sweat running in all her wrinkles, "then I feel sorry for the witch having to live here." She took another stride. The wind of it did not cool her down. The rocks and bushes were the same, but the sand was grayer, and the mountains seemed to have sunk down the sky. Sophie peered into the quivering gray glare ahead, where she thought she could see something rather higher than rock. She took one more stride. Now it was like an oven, but there was a peculiar-shaped pile about a quarter of a mile off, standing on a slight rise in the rock-littered land. It was a fantastical shape of twisted towers, rising to one main tower that pointed slightly askew like a knotty old finger. Sophie climbed out of the boots. It was too hot to carry anything so heavy, so she trudged off to investigate with only her stick. The thing seemed to be made of yellow-gray grit of the waste. At first, Sophie wondered if it might be some strange kind of ant's nest. But as she got near, she could see that it was as if something had fused together thousands of grainy yellow flower pots into a tapering heap. She grinned. The moving castle had often struck her as being remarkably like the inside of a chimney. This building was really a collection of chimney pots. It had to be a fire demon's work. As Sophie panted up the rise, there was suddenly no doubt that this was the witch's fortress. 2 small orange figures came out of the dark space at the bottom and stood waiting for her. She recognized the witch's 2 page boys. Hot and breathless as she was, she tried to speak to them politely to show she had no quarrel with them. "Good afternoon," she said. They just gave her sulky looks. One bowed and held out his hand, pointing toward the misshapen dark archway between the bent columns of chimney pots. Sophie shrugged and followed him inside. The other page walked after her, and of course the entrance vanished as soon as she was through. Sophie shrugged again. She would have to deal with that problem when she came back. She rearranged her lace shawl, straightened her draggled skirts, and walked forward. It was a little like going through the castle door with the knob black down. There was a moment of nothingness, followed by murky light. The light came from greenish-yellow flames that burned and flickered all round, but in a shadowy way which gave no heat and very little light either. When Sophie looked at them, the flames were never where she looking, but always to the side. But that was the way of magic. Sophie shrugged again and followed the page this and way and that among skinny pillars of the same chimney-pot kind as the rest of the building. At length the pages led her to a sort of central den. Or maybe it was just a space between pillars. Sophie was confused by then. The fortress seemed enormous, though she suspected that it was deceptive, just as the castle was. The witch was standing there waiting. Again, it was hard to tell how Sophie knew, except that it could be no one else. The witch was hugely tall and skinny now, and her hair was fair, in a rope-like pigtail over one bony shoulder. She wore a white dress. When Sophie walked straight up to her, brandishing her stick, the witch backed away. "I am not to be threatened," the witch said, sounding tired and frail. "Then give me Miss Angorian and you won't be," said Sophie. "I'll take her and go away." The witch backed away further, gesturing with both hands, and the page boys both melted into sticky orange blobs which rose into the air and flew toward Sophie. "Yucky! Get off!" Sophie cried, beating at them with her stick. The orange blobs did not seem to care for her stick. They dodged it and wove about, and then darted behind Sophie. She was just thinking she had got the better of them when she found herself glued to a chimney-pot pillar by them. Orange, sticky, stuff stranded between her ankles when she tried to move and plucked at her hair quite painfully. "I'd almost rather have green slime," Sophie said. "I hope those weren't real boys." "Only emanations," said the witch. "Let me go," said Sophie. "No," said the witch. She turned away and seemed to lose interest in Sophie entirely. Sophie began to fear that, as usual, she had made a mess of things. The sticky stuff seemed to be getting harder and more elastic every second. When she tried to move, it snapped her back against the pottery pillar. "Where's Miss Angorian?" she said. "You will find her," said the witch. "We will wait until Howl comes." "He's not coming," said Sophie. "He's got more sense, and your curse hasn't all worked anyway." "It will," said the witch, smiling slightly. "Now that you have fallen for our deception and come here, Howl will have to be honest for once." She made another gesture, toward the murky flames this time, and a sort of a throne trundled out from between 2 pillars and stopped in front of the witch. There was a man sitting in it, wearing a green uniform and long, shiny boots. Sophie thought he was asleep at first, with his head out of sight sideways, but the witch gestured again. The man sat up straight, and he had no head on his shoulders at all. Sophie realized she was looking at all that was left of Prince Justin. "If I was Fanny," Sophie said, "I'd threaten to faint. Put his head back on at once. He looks terrible like that." "I disposed of both heads a month ago," said the witch. "I sold Wizard Suleiman's skull when I sold his guitar. Prince Justin's head is walking around somewhere with the other leftover parts. This body is a perfect mixture of Prince Justin and Wizard Suleiman. It is waiting for Howl's head to make it our perfect human. When we have Howl's head, we shall have the new king of Ingary, and I shall rule as queen." "You're mad," Sophie said. "You've no right to make jigsaws of people. And I shouldn't think Howl's head will do a thing you want. It'll slither out somehow. Howl will do exactly as we say," the witch said with a sly, secretive smile. "We shall control his fire demon." Sophie realized she was very scared indeed. She knew she had made a mess of things now. "Where is Miss Angorian?" she said, waving her stick. The witch did not like Sophie to wave her stick. She stepped backward. "I am very tired," she said. "You people keep spoiling my plans. First, Wizard Suleiman would not come near the waste, so that I had to threaten Princess Valeria in order to make the king order him out here. Then, when he came, he grew trees. Then the king would not let Prince Justin follow Suleiman for months, and when he did follow, the silly fool went up north somewhere for some reason, and I had to use all my arts to get him here. Howl had caused me even more trouble. He got away once. I've had to use a curse to bring him in, and while I was finding out enough about him to lay the curse, you got into what was left of Suleiman's brain and caused me more trouble. And now when I bring you here, you wave your stick and argue. I have worked very hard for this moment, and I am not to be argued with." She turned away and wandered off into the murk. Sophie stared after the tall white figure moving among the dim flames. "I think her age has caught up with her," she thought. "She's crazy. I must get loose and rescue Miss Angorian from her somehow." Remembering that the orange stuff had avoided her stick, just as the witch had, Sophie reached back over her shoulders with her stick and wagged it back and forth where the sticky stuff met the pottery pillar. "Get out of it," she said. "Let me go." Her hair dragged painfully, but stringy orange bits began to fly away sideways. Sophie wagged the stick harder. She had worked her head and shoulders loose when there came a dull booming sound. The pale flames wavered, and the pillar behind Sophie shook. Then, with a crash like 1,000 tea sets falling downstairs, a piece of the fortress wall blew out. Light blinded in through a long, jagged hole, and a figure came leaping in through the opening. Sophie turned eagerly, hoping it was Howl, but the black outline had only one leg. It was the Scarecrow again. The witch gave a yowl of rage and rushed toward it with her fair pigtail flying and her bony arms stretched out. The Scarecrow leaped at her. There was another violent bang, and the two of them were wrapped in a magic cloud, like the cloud over Porthaven when Howl and the witch had fought. The cloud battered this way and that, filling the dusty air with shrieks and booms. Sophie's hair frizzed. The cloud was only yards away, going this way and that among pottery pillars, and the break in the wall was quite near, too. As Sophie had thought, the fortress was really not big. Every time the cloud moved across the blinding white gap, she could see through it and see the two skinny figures battling in its midst. She stared and kept wagging her stick behind her back. She was loose, all except her legs, when the cloud streamed across in front of the light one more time. Sophie saw another person leap through the gap behind it. This one had flying black sleeves. It was Howl. Sophie could see the outline of him clearly, standing with arms folded, watching the battle. For a moment it looked as if he was going to let the witch and the Scarecrow get on with it. Then the long sleeves flapped as Howl raised his arms. Above the screaming and booming, Howl's voice shouted one strange, long word, and a long roll of thunder came with it. The Scarecrow and the witch both jolted. Claps of sound rang round the pottery pillars, echo after echo, and each echo carried some of the cloud of magic away with it. It vanished in wisps and swirled away in murky eddies. When it had become the thinnest white haze, the tall figure with the pigtail began to totter. The witch seemed to fold in on herself, thinner and whiter than ever. Finally, as the haze faded clean away, she fell in a heap with a small clatter. As the million soft echoes died, Howl and the Scarecrow were left thoughtfully facing one another across a pile of bones. Good, thought Sophie. She slashed her legs free and went across to the headless figure in the throne. It was getting on her nerves. No, my friend, Howl said to the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow had hopped right among the bones and was pushing them this way and that with its leg. No, you won't find her heart here. Her fire demon will have got that. I think it's had the upper hand of her for a long time now. Sad, really. As Sophie took off her shawl and arranged it decently across Prince Justin's headless shoulders, Howl said, I think the rest of what you were looking for is over here. He walked toward the throne, with the Scarecrow hopping beside him. Typical, he said to Sophie. I break my neck to get here, and I find you peacefully tidying up. Sophie looked up at him. As she had feared, the hard black and white daylight coming through the broken walls showed her that Howl had not bothered to shave or tidy his hair. His eyes were still red-rimmed, and his black sleeves were torn in several places. There was not much to choose between Howl and the Scarecrow. Oh, dear, Sophie thought. He must love Miss Angorian very much. I came for Miss Angorian, she explained, and I thought if I arranged for your family to visit you, it would keep you quiet for once, Howl said disgustedly. But no. Here the Scarecrow hopped in front of Sophie. I was sent by Wizard Suleiman, it said in its mushy voice. I was guarding his bushes in the waste when a witch caught him. He cast all of his magic that he could spare on me and ordered me to come to his rescue. But the witch had taken him to pieces by then, and the pieces were in various places. It has been a hard task. If you had not come and talked me to life again, I would have failed. It was answering the question Sophie had asked it before they both rushed off. So when Prince Justin ordered finding spells, they must have kept pointing to you, she said. Why was that? To me or his skull, said the Scarecrow. Between us, we are the best part of him, and Percival is made of Wizard Suleiman and Prince Justin, Sophie said. She was not sure Letty was going to like this. The Scarecrow nodded its craggy turnip face. Both parts told me that the witch and her fire demon were no longer together, and I could defeat the witch on her own, it said. I thank you for giving me 10 times my former speed. Howl waved it aside. Bring that body with you to the castle, he said. I'll sort you out there. Sophie and I have to get back before that fire demon finds a way of getting inside my defenses. He took hold of Sophie's skinny wrist. Come on, where are those 7-league boots? Sophie hung back. But Miss Angorian, don't you understand? Howl said, dragging at her. Miss Angorian is the fire demon. If he gets inside the castle, then Calcifer's had it, and so have I. Sophie put both hands over her mouth. I knew I'd made a mess of it, she said. It's been in twice already, but it went out. Oh, Lord, groaned Howl. Did it touch anything? The guitar, Sophie admitted. Then it's still in there, said Howl. Come on! He pulled Sophie over to the smashed wall. Follow us carefully, he shouted back to the Scarecrow. I'm going to have to raise a wind. No time to look for those boots, he said to Sophie as they climbed over the jagged edges into the hot sunlight. Just run, and keep running, or I won't be able to move you. Sophie helped herself along with her stick and managed to break into a hobbling run, stumbling among the stones. Howl ran beside her, pulling her. Wind leaped up, whistling, then roaring, hot and gritty, and gray sand climbed around them in a storm that pinged on the pottery fortress. By that time they were not running, but skimming forward in a sort of slow-motion lope. The stony ground sped past underneath. Dust and grit thundered around them, high overhead and streaming far away behind. It was very noisy, and not at all comfortable, but the waste rocketed past. It's not Calcifer's fault, Sophie yelled. I told him not to say. He wouldn't anyway, Howl shouted back. I knew he'd never give away a fellow fire demon. He was always my weakest flank. I thought Wales was, Sophie screamed. No, I left that deliberately, Howl bellowed. I knew I'd be angry enough to stop her if she tried anything there. I had to leave her an opening, see? The only chance I had of coming at Prince Justin was to use that curse she'd put on me to get near her." "So you were going to rescue the prince," Sophie shouted. "Why did you pretend to run away to deceive the witch?" "Not likely," Howl yelled. "I'm a coward. Only way I can do something this frightening is to tell myself I'm not doing it." "Oh dear," Sophie thought, looking round at the swirling grit. "He's being honest. And this is a win. The last bit of the curse has come true." The hot grit hit her thunderously and Howl's grip hurt. "Keep running," Howl bawled. "You'll get hurt at this speed." Sophie gasped and made her legs work again. She could see the mountains clearly now, and a line of green below that was the flowering bushes. Even though yellow sand kept swirling in the way, the mountains seemed to grow and the green line rushed toward them until it was hedge-high. "All my flanks were weak," Howl shouted. "I was relying on Suleiman being alive. Then when all that seemed to be left of him was Percival, I was so scared I had to go out and get drunk. And then you go and play into the witch's hands." "I'm the eldest," Sophie shrieked. "I'm a failure. Garbage," Howl shouted. "You just never stop to think." Howl was slowing down. Dust kicked up round them in dense clouds. Sophie only knew the bushes were quite near because she could hear the rush and rattle of the gritty wind in the leaves. They plunged in among them with a crash, still going so fast that Howl had to swerve and drag Sophie in along, skimming run across a lake. "And you're too nice," he added, above the lap-lap of the water and the patter of sand on the water-lily leaves. "I was relying on you being too jealous to let that demon near the place." They hit the steamy shore at a slow run. The bushes on either side of the green lane thrashed and heaved as they passed, throwing birds and petals into a whirlwind behind them. The castle was drifting slowly down the lane toward them, with its smoke streaming back in the wind. Howl slowed down enough to crash the door open and shot Sophie and himself inside. "Michael!" he shouted. "It wasn't me who let the scarecrow in," Michael said guiltily. Everything seemed to be normal. Sophie was surprised to discover what a short time she had really been away. Someone had pulled her bed out from under the stairs, and Percival was lying in it, still unconscious. Letty and Martha and Michael were gathered round it. Overhead, Sophie could hear Mrs. Fairfax's voice and Fanny's, combined with ominous swishings and thumps that suggested how spiders were having a hard time. Howl let go of Sophie and dived toward the guitar. Before her could touch it, it burst with a long, melodious boom. Strings flailed, splinters of wood showered Howl. He was forced to back away with one tattered sleeve over his face, and Miss Angorian was suddenly standing beside the hearth, smiling. Howl had been right. She must have been in the guitar all this time, waiting for her moment. "Your witch is dead," Howl said to her. "Isn't that too bad?" Miss Angorian said, quite unconcerned. "Now I can make myself a new human who will be much better. The curse is fulfilled. I can lay hands on your heart now." And she reached down into the grate and plucked Calcifer out of it. Calcifer wobbled on top of her clenched fist, looking terrified. "Nobody move," Miss Angorian said warningly. Nobody dared stir. Howl stood stillest of all. "Help!" Calcifer said weakly. "Nobody can help you," said Miss Angorian. "You are going to help me control my new human. Let me show you. I have only to tighten my grip." Her hand that was holding Calcifer squeezed until its knuckles showed pale yellow. Howl and Calcifer both screamed. Calcifer beat this way and that in agony. Howl's face turned bluish, and he crashed to the floor like a tree falling, where he lay as unconscious as Percival. Sophie did not think he was breathing. Miss Angorian was astonished. She stared at Howl. "He's faking," she said. "No, he's not," Calcifer screamed, twisted into a writhing spiral shape. "His heart's really quite soft. Let go." Sophie raised her stick slowly and gently. This time she thought for an instant before she acted. "Stick," she muttered. "Beat Miss Angorian, but don't hurt anyone else." Then she swung the stick and hit Miss Angorian's tight knuckles the biggest crack she could. Miss Angorian let out a squealing hiss like a wet log burning and dropped Calcifer. Poor Calcifer rolled helplessly on the floor, flaming sideways across the flagstones and roaring huskily with terror. Miss Angorian raised a foot to stamp on him. Sophie had to let go of her stick and dive to rescue Calcifer. Her stick, to her surprise, hit Miss Angorian again on its own, and again, and again. But of course it would, Sophie thought. She had talked life into that stick. Mrs. Penstemon had told her so. Miss Angorian hissed and staggered. Sophie stood up holding Calcifer, to find her stick drubbing away at Miss Angorian and smoking with the heat of her. By contrast, Calcifer did not seem very hot. He was milky blue with shock. Sophie could feel that the dark lump of Howl's heart was only beating very faintly between her fingers. It had to be Howl's heart she was holding. He had given it away to Calcifer as part of his contract, to keep Calcifer alive. He must have been very sorry for Calcifer, but all the same, what a silly thing to do. Fanny and Mrs. Fairfax hurried through the door from the stairs, carrying brooms. The sight of them seemed to convince Miss Angorian that she had failed. She ran for the door, with Sophie's stick hovering over her, still clouding at her. "Stop her!" Sophie shouted. "Don't let her get out! Guard all the doors!" Everyone raced to obey. Mrs. Fairfax put herself in the broom cupboard with her broom raised. Fanny stood on the stairs. Letty jumped up and guarded the door to the yard, and Martha stood by the bathroom. Michael ran for the castle door, but Percival leaped up off the bed and ran for the door too. His face was white and his eyes were shut, but he ran even faster than Michael. He got there first, and he opened the door. With Calcifer so helpless, the castle had stopped moving. Miss Angorian saw the bushes standing still in the haze outside and raced for the door with inhuman speed. Before she reached it, it was blocked by the scarecrow looming up with Prince Justin hung across his shoulders, still draped in Sophie's lace shawl. It spread its stick arms across the door, barring the way. Miss Angorian backed away from it. The stick beating at her was on fire now. Its metal end was glowing. Sophie realized it could not last much longer. Luckily, Miss Angorian hated it so much that she seized hold of Michael and dragged him in its way. The stick had been told no to hurt Michael. It hovered, flaming. Martha dashed up and tried to pull Michael away. The stick had to avoid her, too. Sophie had got it wrong as usual. There was no time to waste. "Calcifer," Sophie said, "I shall have to break your contract. Will it kill you?" "It would if anyone else broke it," Calcifer said hoarsely. "That's why I asked you to do it. I could tell you could talk life into things. Look what you did for the scarecrow and the skull, then have another 1,000 years," Sophie said, and willed it very hard as she said it, in case just talking was not enough. This had been worrying her very much. She took hold of Calcifer and carefully nipped him off the black lump, just as she would nip a dead bud off a stalk. Calcifer whirled loose and hovered by her shoulder as a blue teardrop. "I feel so light," he said. Then it dawned on him what had happened. "I'm free!" he shouted. He whirled to the chimney and plunged up it, out of sight. "I'm free!" Sophie heard him shout overhead faintly as he came out through the chimney pot of the hat shop. Sophie turned to Howl with the almost dead black lump, feeling doubtful in spite of her hurry. She had to get this right, and she was not sure how you did. "Well, here goes," she said. Kneeling down beside Howl, she carefully put the black lump on his chest in the leftish sort of place she had felt hers when it troubled her, and pushed. "Go in," she told it. "Get in there and work." And she pushed and pushed. The heart began to sink in and to beat more strongly as it went. Sophie tried to ignore the flames and scuffles by the door and keep up a steady, firm pressure. Her hair kept getting in her way. It fell across her face in reddish-fair hanks, but she tried to ignore that too. She pushed. The heart went in. As soon as it had disappeared, Howl stirred about. He gave a loud groan and rolled over onto his face. "Hell's teeth," he said. "I've got a hangover." "No, you hit your head on the floor," Sophie said. Howl rose up on his hands and knees with a scramble. "I can't stay," he said. "I've got to rescue that fool Sophie." "I'm here," Sophie said, shaking his shoulder. "But so is Miss Angorian. Get up and do something about her. Quickly! The stick was almost entirely in flames by now. Martha's hair was frizzling, and it had dawned on Miss Angorian that the scarecrow would burn. She was maneuvering to get the hovering stick into the doorway. As usual, Sophie thought, I didn't think it through. Howl only needed to take one look. He stood up in a hurry. He held out one hand and spoke a sentence of words that lost themselves in claps of thunder. Plaster fell from the ceiling. Everything trembled, but the stick vanished, and Howl stepped back with a small, hard, black thing in his hand. It could have been a lump of cinder, except that it was same shape as the thing Sophie had just pushed into Howl's chest. Miss Angorian whined like a wet fire and held out her arms imploringly. I'm afraid not, Howl said. You've had your time. By the look of this, you were trying to get a new heart, too. You were going to take my heart and let Calcifer die, weren't you? He held the black thing between both palms and pushed his hands together. The witch's old heart crumbled into black sand and soot and nothing. Miss Angorian faded away as it crumbled. As Howl opened his hands empty, the doorway was empty of Miss Angorian, too. Another thing happened as well. The moment Miss Angorian was gone, the scarecrow was no longer there either. If Sophie had cared to look, she would have seen two tall men standing in the doorway, smiling at one another. The one with the craggy face had ginger hair. The one with the green uniform had vaguer features and a lace shawl draped round the shoulders of his uniform. But Howl turned to Sophie just then. Gray doesn't really suit you, he said. I thought that when I first saw you. Calcifer's gone, Sophie said. I had to break your contract. Howl looked a little sad, but he said, we were both hoping you would. Neither of us wanted to end up like the witch and Miss Angorian. Would you call your hair ginger? Red gold, Sophie said. Not much had changed about Howl that she could see. Now he had his heart back, except maybe that his eyes seemed a deeper color, more like eyes and less like glass marbles. Unlike some people's, she said, it's natural. I've never seen why people put such a value on things being natural, Howl said, and Sophie knew then that he was scarcely changed at all. If Sophie had any attention to spare, she would have seen Prince Justin and Wizard Suleiman shaking hands and clapping one another delightedly on the back. I'd better get back to my royal brother, Prince Justin said. He walked up to Fanny as the most likely person and made her a deep courtly bow. Am I addressing the lady of this house? Not really, Fanny said, trying to hide her broom behind her back. The lady of the house is Sophie, or will be shortly, Mrs. Fairfax said, beaming benevolently. Howl said to Sophie, I've been wondering all along if you would turn out to be that lovely girl I met on May Day. Why were you so scared then? If Sophie had been attending, she would have seen Wizard Suleiman go up to Letty. Now that he was himself, it was clear that Wizard Suleiman was at least as strong-minded as Letty was. Letty looked quite nervous as Suleiman loomed craggily over her. It seemed to be the prince's memory I had of you and not my own at all, he said. That's quite all right, Letty said bravely. It was a mistake. But it wasn't, protested Wizard Suleiman. Would you let me take you on as a pupil at least? Letty went fiery red at this and did not seem to know what to say. That seemed to Sophie to be Letty's problem. She had her own. Howl said, I think we ought to live happily ever after, and she thought he meant it. Sophie knew living happily ever after with Howl would be a great deal more eventful than any story made it sound, though she was determined to try. It should be hair-raising, added Howl. And you'll exploit me, Sophie said. And then you'll cut up all my suits to teach me, said Howl. If Sophie or Howl had had any attention to spare, they might have noticed that Prince Justin, Wizard Suleiman, and Mrs. Fairfax were all trying to speak to Howl, and that Fanny, Martha, and Letty were all plucking at Sophie's sleeves while Michael was dragging at Howl's jacket. That was the neatest use of words of power I ever saw from anyone, Mrs. Fairfax said. I wouldn't have known what to do with that creature. As I often say, Sophie, said Letty, I need your advice. Wizard Howl, said Wizard Suleiman, I must apologize for trying to bite you so often. In the normal way, I wouldn't dream of setting teeth in a fellow countryman. I think this gentleman is a prince, said. Sir, said Prince Justin, I believe I must thank you for rescuing me from the witch. Sophie, said Martha, the spell's off you. Did you hear? But Sophie and Howl were holding one another's hands and smiling, quite unable to stop. Don't bother me now, said Howl. I only did it for the money. Liar, said Sophie. I said, Michael shouted, that Calcifer's come back. That did get Howl's attention, and Sophie's too. They looked at the grate, where, sure enough, the familiar blue face was flickering among the logs. You didn't need to do that, Howl said. I don't mind, as long as I can come and go, Calcifer said. Besides, it's raining out there and market chipping.